Near Farm Talk. My name is JJ Barrett, and I'm the Agriculture and Natural Resources Agent in Wood County. Of course, I have my co-host with the most with me, Evan Wilson, down in Cabell and Wayne. What's up? What's up, Evan?
Going pretty good down here, JJ, and I'm in Milton today, but we're getting ready for the Wayne County 4-H Fun Show tomorrow out in Wayne at Shirley Burgess Park. If y'all have horses, come on down. It's $5 for a class, and you can do as many classes as you want for 20. It's $5 admission. We got a food stand coming in, so it'll be a good day there in Wayne.
Good. Looks like the next couple weeks we're going to have pretty mild temperatures, so maybe as we move into September here, summer's starting to fade away. Maybe highs in the lower 80s. Still a little bit of rain, but I don't think as much as we had whole summer. But it's been an interesting summer now as we head towards October. Real quick for our commodity watch, I've got cash corn at $6.85, soybeans are at $14.55, and wheat is at $8.13. Just a few highlights. A survey that came out from the University of Purdue, 53% of farmers surveyed said their biggest concern for the next year is rising input costs. It's always been amazing, especially with our input cost of fertilizer and feed, especially for our anyone that's putting up hay or raising beef cattle. There may be another avian flu outbreak looming, as it has been detected in Minnesota. Because of the avian flu, of course, if anyone out there has ever been to the grocery store in the last couple of months, the price of eggs has jumped quite a bit, and the cost of chicken has jumped 71% from last summer. And finally, one of the big questions that we'll have answered this fall was the drought that is continuing in northwest Iowa, how that will affect U.S. corn yield, and of course the U.S. corn prices. Those have jumped significantly in the last year. So we would like to welcome our guest for today, Dr. Rakesh Ranant. He is the extension specialist for weeds. Rakesh, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, JJ. It's a beautiful day here in Morgantown.
Good. Of course, a lot of our producers and a lot of our landowners, they always have questions about weeds. Their first question is always, how do I get rid of this, right? Or what do I spray, right, Rakesh?
Correct. Yeah, weeds have always been, wreaking havoc in agriculture historically. So it keeps me in business, people like me in business, to help folks control weeds in their crops, JJ. But having said that, I know we are going to talk about weed control in pasture, especially some of the fall herbicide applications. But right off the bat, I wanted to reinstate or reinforce the fact that herbicides or weed management using herbicides is really not a substitute for good management. In other words, when you see weeds in a pasture or hayfield, it's oftentimes an indication that something in the background, is not quite right. It could be, one of the management practices, such as not using the right stocking density, or overgrazing, or poor rotational grazing, or it could be an indication of some of the soil related factors, such as improper pH, low fertility, etc. So
yeah, Rakesh, maybe since you were talking about herbicides versus some of our management, I know that a lot of maybe not as many this year due to the price of diesel fuel, but a lot, especially for pasture fields, we will go out and brush hog those or clip them. Sometimes maybe for weed control, and maybe sometimes just for aesthetics, just for them, it makes everything look so much neater. But how much control are we really getting with brush hogging compared to either proper rotational grazing or herbicide control?
Yeah, that's a good question, JJ. So The answer to that, I guess, would depend on what you're trying to accomplish, and also what time of the year you're brush hogging. So as you know, brush hogging can be considered as a mechanical method to control weeds, and they are, the brush hogging can be effective if they are carried out earlier on in the season, if you're after annual weeds, so that they don't come to bloom and set seeds. That way, you don't have a buildup of the seeds in the soil's weed seed bank. Now, in conjunction with chemical control, brush hogging can be helpful at times, especially if you're trying to control perennial weeds. So a good strategy, if you're combining brush hogging or mechanical control with chemical control, would be to cut it back, say sometime in June or July, and let it grow. Let it leaf out some more, and then about this time of the year, hit it with the herbicide. That way, what you're accomplishing here is that when the weeds are trying to grow back after a brush hogging event, it's pulling up some of the reserves that is stored in the root system or other perinating organs such as rhizomes, or rootstocks, etc. And that will weaken the underground parts where the energy is stored. So when you apply the herbicide to a weakened root system, that makes it more effective, JJ. Now, I mentioned about timing of brush hogging. So this time of the year, a lot of folks may carry out some brush hogging, but if you're planning to apply a herbicide after brush hogging, then you want to make sure that there is enough regrowth or enough foliage when you come back to the herbicide. That way, the weeds are able to absorb enough material to get a good kill. JJ.
Yeah, so if I say we go out and brush hog today, how soon? We have to wait like a couple weeks?
Yeah, that would depend on the growing conditions. Right now, we have good moisture conditions, in the soil. So I would say wait for about 3 to 4 weeks till you get sufficient regrowth. And again, that would depend on the species, the weeds that you're going after. Now, having said that, if in terms of, and we'll talk about this in more detail in terms of the window for a fall application, but let's say you're brush hogging today and you're coming back, say 3 weeks from today, that would still make it a good time in terms of the window for a fall application, with the herbicide, JJ.
Yeah, so you're also saying that probably the best, if we are going to use clipping or pastures or brush hogging, and try to get those before those weeds go to seed. Am I correct?
Correct. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, sometimes that can be tough depending on what our rainfall is. But what about some of our hay fields? I guess before we get into some of our other weeds, I know that one of the biggest ones in our area, of course, is Johnson grass. That you don't really see a lot of it when you take off the first cutting, but boy, when that second cutting comes back, that the rest of your field will be 8 to 10 inches high, and the Johnson grass will be 3 or 4 feet. What are some strategies our producers can use to try to control that Johnson grass?
Yeah, so Johnson grass, as you know, is a perennial, right? And so if you pull up the Johnson grass plant, you'll see the real vigorous rhizomes that are beneath the soil. So what you are trying to accomplish is to kill as many as much rhizomes as possible, either chemically or through repeated, cutting, mowing intervals, or cutting it back repeatedly. So Johnson grass tend to grow in patches in a hayfield, right? So during early stages of emergence, in other words, during early stages of infestation, if they're growing in pockets here and there, in a hayfield, then it would be prudent to spot treat with a non-selective herbicide such as Roundup or any herbicide that contains glyphosate. So just spot treat that area, make sure that that you treat the foliage well to get sufficient uptake. And then some of it may grow back next year, but if you do a good job, you're going to get most of it, at least 90% control that from that spot application, JJ. Now, if they're distributed throughout the hayfield, then using a weed wiper would be a good strategy. That way, you're able to cover a larger area and also not kill your legumes, as opposed to a broadcast application with a and if obviously if you're using a non-selective herbicide, you're going to kill everything there, right? Such as
Right.
so for cool season pastures, really we don't have a herbicide that is labeled to selectively control Johnson grass in our desirable grass species. Now, in some of the states where they have warm season grasses, there's a herbicide called Maverick, which has the active ingredient sulfosulfuron, and that does a good job to selectively control Johnson grass. But unfortunately, we don't have it labeled in cool season grasses. And we have done some research to look at injury levels and found out that there could be some transient injury for something like tall fescue, but it will grow back. But regardless, the manufacturer hasn't pursued a label for such herbicides for use in cool season pastures. So right now, in terms of herbicides, the only tool we have is Roundup or any other glyphosate containing herbicide to either apply as a spot treatment or to use a weed wiper.
Rakesh, Evan and I were just talking before the program started. What about if you have access, if you can put up electric fencing, or if you have fencing up, about the second or third cutting, letting the animals graze in there to try to control some of that Johnson grass? They really seem to take care of that issue. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that is good, can be a good strategy. And again, as you know, Johnson grass was introduced as a forage by the settlers, so there is a nutritional value, for Johnson grass. But so in early stages, and especially before the first frost, if you can let in animals and mob graze it, as you said, you maybe use a high stocking rate and go after it aggressively. That can be a good strategy. Now, the only thing that you got to be careful is that after that first frost, Johnson grass produces a toxin in it called prussic acid. So do not let animals graze Johnson grass after a frost event. But otherwise, as you pointed out, as you and Evan pointed out, that can be a good strategy. To do grazing as a management approach for Johnson grass.
And for that, over my shoulder here is a picture of a farm out in Wayne. We've got him started graze Johnson grass this summer. Here in a few minutes, I'm gonna switch it over. He did 20 cows on 3 acres for about a week, and all you can see now is left is just the stems of the Johnson grass, and you can see the trunk of the base of that tree that's out in the middle of that field. So he done a really good job of that. So I'm kind of excited to see where his Johnson grass population is next year in that field. This was his hay field.
Okay. Now, I saw that picture and I was about to ask you if it was Johnson grass, but I had a feeling that it may be switchgrass. But thanks, thanks for pointing that out.
It was Johnson grass. I'm going to get the picture in a minute from a week later. I'm doing the dung beetle trial with him, and like, why don't we put the cattle in there and see what they'll do? And they grazed it down pretty quick.
Good. Now, I mentioned about repeated cutting, right? Or mowing it back repeatedly. So what you are doing here, Evan, is exactly the same thing.
Mhm.
If you're letting animals graze it, what happens is that each time the Johnson grass is trying to grow back, it is pulling up some of the sugars or energy that is stored in the rhizomes, and that eventually weakens the the root system. So if you do it at frequent intervals, eventually it can deplete all the food reserves and essentially killing the Johnson grass. Now, the only thing that you got to be careful about is that if you do not control Johnson grass, if you let it stay in a field or in a hay field for a long time, then it can become very dominant, and then it can render it less productive compared to your more desirable species. So
There's the after. If you can see that. So this was before 20 cows for a week, and this is after.
Oh,
that is a good demonstration there. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it looks like next year, Evan.
Rakesh, let's head into the what weeds are most vulnerable here in the fall for control. I know that we hit a lot of anything that's a biennial, a lot of our thistles, especially a hated enemy of mine, Canada thistle. What are some of those weeds that are most vulnerable in the fall that we can control?
Yeah, so JJ, before we discuss that, let me just briefly talk about the biology and life cycle of weeds. So as you know, weeds can be classified as annuals, biennials, and perennials. Annuals, such as ragweed, pigweed, cocklebur, etc., take 1 year to complete their life cycle. And most of the competition would be during the growing season, during the summer months from annuals. Now, biennials take 2 years to complete their life cycle, and most of the biennials germinate or have already germinated by this time of the year, late summer, early fall. And during the first year's growth, they stay as rosettes or in the vegetative stage. And then during the second year, they bolt, come to bloom, and then towards the end of the second year, they complete their life cycle. And then the third group are perennials, which have an indeterminate life cycle. We talked about Johnson grass. So some of the more aggressive or troublesome weeds in pastures and even in hay fields can be those perennials. So fall would be a good time to apply systemic herbicides to go after both biennials and perennials. So you mentioned thistles, right? So there are biennial thistles such as musk thistle, bull thistle, or plumeless thistle, etc. So most of them again are out there in the rosette stage. You got to look carefully, and they may stay in that state till early spring, and then all of a sudden they may take off. So if you hit it now, and if you miss it in early spring before it takes off, would be a good timing too. You mentioned about Canada thistle. Yeah, that is another terrible weed. I mean, for the past 20 plus years that I've been here in West Virginia, it's been a perpetual problem, perennial problem. Every year I get calls about controlling Canada. How do I manage Canada thistle, which is a perennial weed. So again, for biennials and perennials, fall is a good time to hit it with a systemic herbicide. And depending on what type of weeds you're after, you can choose your herbicide chemistries. With some of the more aggressive weeds, such as Canada thistle, you may need to use a herbicide that has aminopyrrolate in it, and we can discuss all that in more detail later. But with some of the other biennial weeds, such as musk thistle, you can use something like 2,4-D ester and still get good control of those biennial weeds.
Rakesh, what makes the Canada thistle so hard to control? Is it just the fact that it spreads by those underground rhizomes?
Exactly. Yeah. So that's why it's very difficult to control. And if you've observed, how it establishes in a pasture or hayfield, initially you will see a few plants here and there, and then it spreads out like a colony, and takes over large areas of a pasture or a hayfield. So once you have that well-established colony, which may take a few years to establish, it's not going to go away overnight either. In other words, you may have to come back, even with some of the more effective herbicides we have. It may take repeated applications or sequential applications over a period of 3 to 4 years to completely control it, JJ. So it's a matter of persistence, with some of these aggressive perennial weeds, such as Canada thistle.
Now, Rakesh, you were talking about the amino pyrrolid, like Forefront, Grazon Next have that, but I've done some reading up on Stinger, which is the clopyralid. Why does that seem to be a little bit more effective on the Canada thistle, or is it?
Yeah, so these herbicides that end with pyrrolid, clopyrrolid, aminopyrrolid, and then you have picloram, which is in the same subclass of growth regulator type of herbicides. They are all effective on weeds that belong to the aster family, or the sunflower family. So that includes thistles. And with Canada thistle, as you said earlier, it's a tougher weed compared to the annual asters. So either aminopyrrolid or clopyrrolid are the more recommended, are the more effective herbicides to control Canada thistle, JJ.
Yeah,
Now, having said that, I'm sure you're going to ask about residues, right?
right.
With some of these herbicides, they can persist not only in the soil, but in the treated hay. And once the animals feed on either the forage or hay, the traces of this herbicide can pass through the digestive tract and remain in the manure. So if you're using straw or manure later on for, as a mulch or fertilizer for, in a garden type situation, it can cause, serious injury to, to such sensitive plants. So you got to be really careful about moving materials, either hay or straw or manure out of the farm.
Rakesh, does it say on the label, can you sell hay off the farm if you've used that for a year?
I was going to say that, yeah, you're supposed to keep all treated material inside a farm for a period of 18 months after treatment. So yeah, that states right there on the label.
Yeah, but I mean, that's one of the drawbacks, but one of the, I guess, positives of some of these products with residual is that we can get pretty long-lasting control of some of our broadleaves.
Correct.
Weeds.
Yeah. So some of the tougher to control weeds, with these chemistries, you get more effective control. So the herbicides that contain aminopyrrolid are Milestone, Chaparral, and as you pointed out, Grazon Next. And there is a new herbicide called Duracor. So that also contains aminopyrrolid. Another concern with use of these herbicides is obviously all the effective herbicides, if you apply them in a broadcast fashion in a pasture or a hayfield, it's going to kill the legumes, right? The clovers and other desirable legumes. So in the case of these long-lasting herbicides or herbicides that have extended residual activity, you have to wait a year before you can go back and reseed your legumes. That way, you get good emergence and establishment of those legumes, and it'll state on the label, what the replant interval is, for some of these herbicides, JJ.
Yeah, Rakesh, you mentioned 2,4-D. I know in one of the questions that I sent you, the 2,4-D has been around for a long time. I know that there's a couple different forms of it. Maybe you can kind of explain that. I always have a lot of questions about that, but is that still a pretty useful and effective herbicide that we can use?
Yeah, 2,4-D, as you mentioned, it's actually the herbicide that was discovered during the Second World War. So it's been around for almost 80 years or so, and that the discovery of 2,4-D sort of advanced chemical weed control, through the discovery of new herbicide families, so on and so forth. But still, it is a very, very effective herbicide. So you mentioned about different formulations or types of 2,4-D. So you have the amine formulation and the ester formulation. Both of them essentially have 2,4-D as the active ingredient, but the ester formulation is an oil-based formulation, which makes it more effective compared to the amine-based formulation, which means that it can penetrate the waxy cuticle of weeds better than an amine formulation, and make it more effective that way. Now, having said that, one of the concerns or drawbacks of using an ester formulation is that they have a low vapor pressure, or they can volatilize easily. So if you apply ester formulations on a hot day where the air temperature is, say, above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, there's a potential for it to cause injury to non-target or sensitive plantings, even though they're not right next to the area where you're treated. So in other words, it can cause injury from the vapors and not just the drift, JJ. So if you use ester formulations, as long as the temperatures is above 55 degrees, approximately daytime temperature above 50 to 55 degrees, it should be adequate. But do not apply when the temperatures exceed 80 degrees Fahrenheit.
Rakesh, what I'm seeing down my neck of the woods, here's the field of the picture I think I sent you a couple weeks ago, is primarily smartweed. And historically, in my past, I didn't see much problem with smartweed, but this pasture hayfield was primarily that. Also seeing some influence of Japanese stiltgrass in our pastures and our hayfields along streams, along forest lands, and then joint head grasses in that too. Can you speak on those three and how our farmers can kind of help hopefully combat those or knock them back some?
Yeah. So Evan, you sent me some pictures of I guess a low-lying area, right? That was heavily infested with smartweed, and you mentioned that there were some cases of animal fatality. Two horses died. Is that what happened in that field, Evan?
Yes, sir. There was no vet autopsy or necropsy taken, but that the symptoms they said kind of fell in that ballpark with what that case study out of Australia had showed with cattle. But yeah, they had lost 2 horses this summer, and then before that they were fairly healthy.
Right. So yeah, smartweed, in small numbers they're okay, but if that is the only available plant material, that could cause it. But having said that, let us talk about management, Evan. So years ago, I did a study near Elkins where a pasture was being taken over by smartweed, and we tried, some of the different growth regulator type herbicides, and found out that a combination of 2,4-D plus dicamba, which is sold as Weedmaster, does a good job to control smartweed. The only thing is that you have to apply it, when they're during the early stages of growth, before they come to bloom. So we are looking at, say sometime in May or early June, depending on where it's growing, And Crossbow does a good job on smartweed too. So you mentioned about two other invasive grasses. One is jointed grass, and the other, did you say Japanese stillgrass, Evan?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, so these are two warm season grasses that we are starting to see, especially jointed grass, taking over more and more pastures, especially in the eastern panhandle and southern parts of the state. So both these are non-native species that are considered to be invasive. So the good thing is that, unlike Johnson grass, these are both annuals. So, which means that if you are able to control it during the early periods of invasion, then you're likely to get ahead of it. So there are again, a couple of approaches. Evan, one is to use a herbicide, a pre-emergence herbicide. So with both these grasses, we have found out that Prowl H2O, which has the active ingredient pendimethalin, if applied before they germinate, it provides good control of both species. Now, with Japanese stillgrass, you will have to apply the highest label rate of Prowl, that is 4 quarts to an acre, to get good control. But with jointed grass, you can get good control by applying 2 quarts to an acre. Now, it's a little bit tricky in terms of application timing. As you remember, you have to apply this herbicide before they germinate. So Japanese stillgrass germinates, we have found out over the past few years that it germinates about roughly 1 to 2 weeks before jointed grass. And we have seen germination as early as middle of March to 3rd week of March, and definitely by the 1st or 2nd week of April, your Japanese stillgrass would have germinated. So if you time your Prowl application accordingly, that should give you good control. In other words, applied before they germinate should give you good control of stillgrass. Now with jointed grass, you can afford to wait a little longer. Typically, they germinate anytime from the 3rd week of March till the middle of April or so. That's when you have peak germination or initial germination. So you can apply, the Prowl H2, a little later, a week or so later compared to stillgrass. Now we have monitored the germination and tried to correlate that with the buildup of growing degree days, and we found out that stillgrass can germinate when the growing degree days hit about 50 or 55, and jointed grass can germinate when it's about 100 or so. Now, not everybody can keep track of the growing degree days, right? So we may have to look for other indicators around phenological indicators. So typically, in West Virginia, if you look at Forsythia bloom, that can be a good indicator. So for a stillgrass, you may have to apply it just when the forsythias begin to bloom. In other words, you don't want to wait till the buds break and you start to see full bloom. By then they may have germinated. So when the forsythias start to show signs of blooming, that oftentimes correspond to that 50-55 growing degree days that I mentioned earlier. Now with jointed grass, when they're in full bloom, when the forsythias are in bloom, you can apply Prowl and still get good control. Now keep in mind that this period, this window is very short. It can happen abruptly. In other words, if you wait for 2 weeks or so, then you miss that window. So number of factors are at play. If you're out, if, the soil moisture conditions, right? I mean, if it's too wet, you can obviously go out there with the equipment to spray the herbicide. On the other hand, if it's too dry, the herbicides are not going to be activated either. The Prowl H2 needs to be activated with some soil moisture. So if it's too dry during that time, you may not get consistent control. Now, you mentioned about mob grazing or letting animals feed. So I've had some folks talk about mob grazing or mentioned that mob grazing has been effective for either of these two annual grasses, Evan. Although it's not a highly desirable species.
I heard some of that, but I wasn't sure how well it really went. In this field that was smart wheat, it had a high density of joint head grass in there too, because they're along one of the rivers down this way, and easy it's in the floodplain, stuff just washes in and that seed takes off. A couple other, do we have any questions from our audience? Weeds they see problem plants?
Evan, let's change direction real
Okay.
quick. Rakesh, I always get a lot of questions about this, and maybe it's a little, we don't spend enough time talking about surfactants. How important is it to put surfactant in with a lot of our herbicide mixes, and explain a little bit how surfactants work and when we go to the farm store or we order online, what product do we need to use?
Yeah, so surfactant is an adjuvant or something that is added to the tank to help improve the uptake or the absorption of the herbicide solution. So what it does, JJ, as you know, is that it breaks down the surface tension of individual spray droplets. So in other words, what happens is that if you imagine a single spray droplet, when it lands on the leaf surface, the contact area is minimal, right? Because it's almost spherical, right? If you imagine a spray droplet. So what surfactant does is that it flattens it. It breaks down the surface tension, allowing more contact area with the leaf surface, allowing better uptake. So that's how it works essentially. So having said that, most of the broadleaf herbicides that we use in pasture, a surfactant would be beneficial. A couple of herbicides that I can think of that would not need a surfactant. One is Crossbow, which is an oil-based formulation. And another, I think, is Stinger, that does not need a surfactant. But otherwise, it would be a good idea to add a what they refer to as an NIS, or a non-ionic surfactant, to most of the commonly used herbicides. Now, you can the ratio in which a surfactant needs to be added is approximately 0.25% volume by volume. In other words, to every 100 gallons of spray solution, you can add 1 quart of the surfactant.
Okay, I was going to ask you about that. I thought the label said 1 to 2 pints for, well, I guess 2 pints will be a quart. 1 to 2 pints per 100 gallons. Is that about the rule of thumb?
Yeah, that's right. 2 pints per 100 gallons should put you in the right range. Now, there are a couple of herbicides that would require a crop oil concentrate, such as methylated seed oil, and one is Facet, which has the active ingredient quinclorac. So in that case, surfactant, I mean, non-ionic surfactant is not going to work. You need to add that surfactant, and a lot of times it will have to be added, to 1% ratio. In other words, one gallon per 100 gallons of the spray solution.
I guess that leads into my next question, Rakesh. How important is it to read the label on a herbicide? I mean, most of the products that I use, it'll say right on there whether to use a ionic surfactant. I know that there's a couple that it calls for crop oil. I'm trying to think. Post is one of them, I believe, but I would say most of them require a a non-ionic surfactant. But go into this a little bit about reading the label on some of our products.
Yeah, it's a good point, JJ. It's something very simple, yet a lot of times, folks can make mistakes by not simple mistakes, which can be costly, but by not following the label. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about personal protective equipment, right? PPE. So it'll be stated on the label of a product on what type of PPE should be worn while applying that particular pesticide. Then rates of application, and it'll tell you what rate to apply for the species of weeds that you're after, and also based on the height of the weed. So you can apply low rates when the weeds are obviously younger or shorter, and you may have to use higher rates when they are taller. And then it'll tell you about restrictions such as grazing restrictions. How many days you'll have to wait between application of the herbicide before you can let animals in. And a lot of times, it's 0 days, but some herbicides, for example, 2,4-D, you'll have to wait for 7 days. Dicamba, you'll have to wait for a month. And especially if they're lactating animals, there are more restrictions in terms of grazing. Then it'll tell you about the haying interval. The label will tell you how many days you'll have to wait after applying the herbicide before you can cut hay. And then other general types of information will also be stated on the label. And also these days there are products that do not have an EPA number. So when you buy a herbicide, make sure that an EPA number is stated on the label. If you do not see an EPA number, it means that it is not something that is registered through the Environmental Protection Agency. It could be something that may not work, because I've heard from folks that there are all kinds of snake oils around, folks trying to sell materials. So, and such materials do not have an EPA number. So that's something to look out for. And most of the standard herbicides, should have an EPA number.
Real quick, Rakesh, I wanted to make another point about sometimes when I'm working with my group of farmers, when we do our pesticide video, I give them a little quiz, and the first question always is, what's the most important aspect of pest control? And that is identifying the pest. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how important it is for scouting this time of year for our hay fields and our pastures, if we're going through the four-wheeler, to get off and kind of take a good walk to see what's going on out there in our fields?
Yeah, as you pointed out, JJ, identifying the pest, knowing what you're dealing with, that is the first and foremost or most important step, in when it comes to pest management. So it's always a good idea to map your pasture, take some notes on where you have some of these trouble spots, and try to correlate that with management practices. Is that an area that has low fertility? Is that an area where the weeds could be indicative of other problems such as soil acidity? Is there an area where the stocking density is high? Where the grazing pressure is high? So yeah, so those kind of when you scout the pasture or a hayfield, you can sort of make those decisions that'll help improve your weed control effectiveness, JJ.
Yeah, maybe another. I know it's always to go a little pasture walk in the fall. Always seems to help out. See what's out there. Real quick about you talked a little about soil fertility and management on how to control some of our weeds.
Mhm.
Is there certain weeds that signal I know I'm getting maybe into the field of one of my farmers does everything by the signs of the moon and so forth, but are there certain weeds that are, if you have those, that's a sign of there's a certain nutrient that's lacking, calcium or magnesium or a low pH or something that's lacking in the soil, and then you have an abundance of a certain weed?
Yeah, I can share with you some of the weeds that come on top of my mind as it relates to problems or lack of fertility or improper pH, etc. So, for example, if you have weeds such as oxeye daisy, that can be an indication of low fertility. Crabgrass can be an indication of low levels of calcium and magnesium. Crabgrass. Weeds such as brome or broom sedge can be an indication of low pH. Again, some of the brambles, can be an indication of low pH too. Weeds such as goosegrass, and you have prostrate knotweed, that can be an indication of high levels of compaction of the soil. So these are some of the weeds that, and on the other hand, if you have weeds such as pigweed or common lamb squatters, that can be an indication of high levels of nitrogen, in that area. So oftentimes you see such weeds around the barnyard, where there's a lot of manure. Obviously, the nitrogen levels are going to be high in such areas. Yeah, so those are some of the weeds that come to my mind, JJ. Can you guys think of anything else that that might indicate?
Typically, the broom sedge just around just means that you're low pH, low phosphorus levels, and of course in a lot of our areas where we feed, I always see a lot of the amaranth or pigweed, lamb's quarter. Especially sometimes that those areas seem to you get that fertility build up there and high weed pressure.
Correct. Yeah. And that also reminds me of some of the deep-rooted perennial weeds, such as hemdoggbane, milkweed. They have roots that penetrate deep into the soil, right? So that can also, those weeds can be an indication of poor fertility. So what is happening is that your desirable forages do not have sufficient nutrients on the topsoil. So the deep root system of these weeds help them establish, because they can penetrate into deeper profiles of the soil and pull up nutrients from there. So yeah, so a lot of times these perennials can be an indication of not only poor fertility levels, but as we discussed earlier, poor management too.
Yeah, Rakesh, before we run out of time, you said that you had done some recent research with hemp dogbane. Not that any of us have that in our hayfields, but if we were to talk about that, what are some strategies? You've done some research. What are some things that we can do to try to control that? It's not so much in our pastures, but in our hayfields.
Yeah. So if you're looking at mechanical control, repeated cutting it back repeatedly, and you can only do so much in hayfields, right? So that's part of the reason why it becomes a problem in hayfields. So a lot of times, if you have high levels of hemdoggbane, you may have to apply a herbicide to get an upper hand or to get good control. So herbicides that are effective, based on some of the research that we have done here, are those that contain the active ingredient fluroxypyr. So that would be present in Pasture Guard and Surmount. So these are two herbicides that are effective to control hemdoggbane. Now, other herbicides such as crossbow are also somewhat effective. Now, even with some of these more effective herbicides, you're not going to get excellent control with a single application. So if you have a hayfield that is overtaken by hemdog-bane, if you apply either surmount or pasture guard, you're more than likely going to see about roughly 80% control the first year, but you'll see a significant suppression. The next year, you will see that there's still hemdog-bane, but you may have to apply the herbicide again the following year, and it might take 2 or 3 years of sequential applications to get good control of hemdog.
Rakesh, what's the is that similar? We take off the first cutting and then get that knocked back, and once it gets some regrowth, is that the best time to apply herbicide to that, or tell us what to do here?
Right, yeah. So take the first cutting, let it grow back, and then just before, during the pre-bloom stage, that's a good time to hit it. So you're looking at, sometime in August or so, depending on the location. So yeah, hit it when they're beginning to bloom. That is when hemdog-bane is most susceptible to some of these effective herbicides. Now, if you let me talk for 1 minute about some research that we did here recently. So last year, we had a demonstration here in Preston County, Bruce Lloyd, Bill Shockey, and myself. We applied pasture guard using a weed wiper and it was a field that was heavily infested with hemdog-bane. And 1 year later, just as I mentioned to you earlier, there was still hemdog-bane in the treated area, but we saw about roughly 80% reduction from that year's treatment. And what we did was we took clippings of both the forage and the hemdog-bane and took some measurements and tried to come up with how it would affect yield. So when we measured, and so we did that for both the treated area and the untreated or the control strip. So with the treated area, we had roughly 1.9 tons of hay dry matter 1 year after treatment, whereas in the control, the dry matter of hay was 1.1 tons per acre. So you saw a reduction by about 80% of forage, in the untreated area the following year. And there was a strong negative correlation between, hemdog-bane dry weight and forage dry weight, as you would expect.
Oh, so you said they used a weed wiper?
Yes, we used the weed wiper, correct? Yeah, a rotary weed wiper.
Now, in that, I know that the concentrations, how maybe discuss with the audience, is it how much more concentrated does the product have to be in the weed wiper?
That's a good point that you raised, JJ. So typically, for herbicides that require about an broadcast application rate of approximately 1 quart an acre, the corresponding rate or the concentration of that in a rotary weed wiper would be a 5% solution. So 5 parts of herbicide to 95 parts of water is what you need the concentration to be when you use a weed wiper. And if you're using a weed wiper, apply the herbicides in both directions. In other words, travel in one direction and then come back in the opposite direction, so that you get coverage of both sides of the weeds.
Oh, what time of year did they do that?
Yeah, so you need a good height difference between the forage and the weeds. So what you're trying to accomplish with the weed wiper is to control your tall growing perennial weeds such as ironweed, hemdog-bane, milkweed, etc. And even Johnson grass, talked about Johnson grass. So as long as there is a good height difference, you can use a weed wiper. And you have to be careful if you're using a non-selective herbicide such as Roundup, which is commonly used in weed wiper. First of all, there should not be any drips. Drips can happen in a weed wiper, and obviously that can cause injury to the forage. But even with selective herbicides such as Pasture Guard, one thing that you're trying to accomplish from Weed Viper is to minimize injury to legumes, right? So you're trying to come into contact only with your weeds by having the differential height between weeds and forage. So you're looking at in general, a pre-bloom stage of most of these perennial weeds would be a good time to use the Weed Viper. So with, again, talking about late summer months, and one thing that you have to be careful or keep in mind is a lot of times during this time of the year there's low levels of moisture in the soil. You have dry conditions, and if you apply a systemic herbicide at that time, it's not going to be very effective because the weeds are not growing at that time. So if that's
we don't have to worry about this year, Rakesh.
yeah, this fortunately that way it's been a good year for weed control. Yeah. So yeah, that's another thing that you have to keep in mind, JJ.
Yeah, I was some of our drought. So if you have some drought stressed weeds, I guess your only option is to go in there and clip them for now.
Yeah, I mean that's if you because your herbicides are not going to be effective. Yeah, I think clipping it back would be an effective strategy. Now we're running with about 5 minutes more, but I don't know if you had a question about brushes, JJ. I just wanted to quickly touch base about brush management in pastures because brushes such as autumn olive, multiflora rose are major problems in West Virginia. So as long if these weeds are about shoulder height, you can do a foliar application of a good effective herbicides such as crossbow, Grayson Next, etc. are effective on both these species. For multiflora rose, anything that has metsulfuron, you Cimarron Plus or Escort, these are effective for multiflora rose. Now with autumn olive, if they're much taller, if they become woody, then you're probably better off to do a dormant application with a crop with either number 2 diesel oil or a crop oil. So there you'll have to use an oil-based herbicide such as either Crossbow or Remedy. So mix, if you're using Remedy, mix 1 part of Remedy to 5 parts of the oil, diesel number 2 diesel oil, or if you're using Crossbow, you need approximately a 5% solution. One part Crossbow to 19 to 20 parts of the oil.
Yeah, I think a lot of I've talked to several people have good luck with the Remedy Ultra. Mixing that up.
Yeah. So apply that when they're in the dormant stage, once the leaves have fallen off, and apply it right above the soil to about 15 to 18 inches at a height of about 15 to 18 inches above the soil, all around the stem or the trunk of these brushes. And each individual stem will have to be treated to get good control.
Okay. We're about out of time, Rakesh, but I've got one more question about. I was reading a fact sheet from North Dakota State. It was saying in the fall that you want to apply some of these herbicides as late as possible prior to frost, especially maybe for some of these biennials. Is that true? And what weeds were we targeting that we'd want to do that? Because I know that one of the other questions we didn't get to, but a lot of our herbicides have to reach a certain temperature to be effective, correct?
Correct, yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, you need the daytime temperatures to be at least 55 degrees or so during fall for them to be effective. And between 55 and 80, higher the temperature, the more effective it is. Now, there's been some research done in Iowa where they looked at frost events and then timing of herbicide application. So with weeds, some of the biennial weeds such as musk thistle or bull thistle, they found out that a few minor frost events, as long as the temperatures hover around 30, 31 degrees, as long as it's not a deep frost, you can still come back after a frost and if the weeds are growing, you can still hit it with the herbicide and get good control. And they've gotten good control even after 3 or 4 minor or mild frost events. Now, if you have a deep killing frost where it has killed the entire plant or weeds in this case, then it may not be very effective. But as long as they are growing, that's a good sign, or that's a good indication that the herbicide will be taken up and be effective, JJ.
Cool. Well, Rakesh, we appreciate you coming on the program. We are out of time. It's about 11 o'clock. I've got if my camera doesn't always pick this up well. There you go. Our throwback artist of the day is Crystal Gale. So one of my favorites. I've got in my CD collection. I'm playing in the car right now. But Rakesh, my dad always said that there were 2 types of music, country and Western. So we need to know who your favorite country music artist is. And I know that you've been on the program before, so you're going to have to pick somebody else.
All right. Last time I mentioned Led Zeppelin, that didn't go very well with you, did it?
Led Zeppelin, that's rock.
No. So once I listened to this song by, I believe it was Bill Monroe, a song that was recorded in the 30s. I think
He's king of bluegrass.
Yeah, exactly, bluegrass. Yeah, old timer. What would you give in exchange for your soul? And I like the lyrics of that song really, when it's very meaningful. Back from those days. So
we didn't know you were a bluegrass fan. My goodness.
JJ,
thanks for having me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Before we wrap up, maybe we should do a preview here of our schedule for the rest of the month.
Sure.
Our guest speakers. Next Friday, we'll be extending the garden season into fall and winter with Bob Gregory of Bree Gardens out of Menora, West Virginia. And then September 23rd is Farm Safety Awareness with Dan Neenan. He's with the National Education Center for Farm Safety. And then to wrap out the month of September 30th, we'll do Adding Value to Feeder Cows with Dr. Daryl Peel, out of Oklahoma State Extension Livestock Marketing Specialist. So we have a busy month coming up here on Farm Talk, a lot of great programs, a lot of great speakers, some new ones we haven't had on here before. So make sure you tune in next Friday at 10 o'clock for extending the garden season.
All right, awesome. Again, we want to thank our special guest, Dr. Rakesh Chadron. And well, I'm sure we'll have him on again. I was going to talk a little about Cocklebur, but we didn't get to that. So
thanks, guys. Good program.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having
you all.
Thank you. I just want to remind everyone our programs and activities offered by West Virginia University Extension Service are available to all persons without regard to race, color, sex, disability, religion, age, veteran status, political beliefs, sexual orientation, national origin, and marital or family status. You're a Mountaineer Farm Talk, and we hope everyone enjoys their weekend.